The movie opens with a dark and eerie scene in an affluent, predominantly white suburban neighborhood. A young black man named Andre Hayworth is walking alone at night, talking on his phone, trying to navigate his way through the unfamiliar streets. Suddenly, a white car begins slowly following him. Andre becomes increasingly anxious and tries to change his direction. The car stops, and a masked figure steps out, quickly overpowers Andre, and knocks him unconscious. The figure drags Andre into the car, and it drives away. The story then shifts to Chris Washington, a talented black photographer living in the city. He's getting ready to visit the family of his white girlfriend, Rose Armitage. As Chris packs, Rose reassures him that her parents are not racist and that they will love him. However, Chris is nervous about the visit, especially because Rose hasn't told her family that he's black. Before leaving, Chris talks with his best friend, Rod Williams, a TSA agent, who warns him about the potential awkwardness of the trip. Rod humorously advises Chris to be cautious, but Chris dismisses his friend's concerns. As Chris and Rose drive to her family's estate in upstate New York, they share playful banter and discuss their relationship. On the way, a deer suddenly jumps in front of their car, and they hit it. The impact is jarring, and the deer is killed. Chris is visibly shaken, and he goes to check on the animal. The sight of the dying deer triggers a deep emotional response in Chris. Shortly after, a police officer arrives at the scene. Even though Rose was driving, the officer asks for Chris's ID. Rose stands up for Chris, accusing the officer of racial profiling. The officer eventually backs down. Chris and Rose arrive at her family's sprawling, isolated estate. They are greeted by Rose's parents, Dean and Missy Armitage. Dean, a neurosurgeon, is overly friendly and tries too hard to show that he's not racist, making comments like, "I would have voted for Obama a third time if I could." Chris also meets the family's black servants, Georgina, the housekeeper, and Walter, the groundskeeper. Both behave strangely, speaking in stilted, overly polite tones and exhibiting odd. At dinner, Chris meets Rose's brother, Jeremy. Jeremy is immediately confrontational and unsettling. He questions Chris about his athletic background, making comments about his physical abilities and suggesting that Chris could be a beast if he trained in martial arts. Jeremy's aggressive behavior makes the dinner tense, and Rose eventually has to intervene to defuse the situation. Chris is uncomfortable, but tries to brush it off as awkward family dynamics. Later that night, Chris struggles to sleep and goes outside to smoke. As he steps outside, he notices Walter running in a straight line toward him in a bizarre, almost robotic manner, only to turn at the last moment. Chris is disturbed by this strange behavior and decides to head back inside. When Chris returns to the house, he encounters Missy, who catches him smoking. She offers to hypnotize him to help him quit, but Chris initially declines. However, Missy insists, and Chris reluctantly agrees to the session. Missy begins the hypnosis by having Chris focus on the sound of her spoon stirring in a teacup. As she asks Chris about his mother's death, he becomes emotional and is slowly drawn into a trance. Missy uses Chris's trauma to send him into the sunken place, a dark, paralyzing mental space where he is conscious but completely unable to move or speak. Chris is horrified as he watches Missy from a distance, unable to control his own body. Missy snaps her fingers, and Chris suddenly wakes up in his bed, unsure if the hypnosis was real or just a nightmare. The next morning, Chris wakes up feeling uneasy, unsure of what happened the night before. When he mentions the hypnosis to Rose, she dismisses it as a weird dream. Later that day, the Armitages host a large gathering of their wealthy white friends. The guests are eerily fascinated by Chris, making a series of awkward and racially charged comments. One woman feels his muscles, commenting on how strong he must be, while another asks if being black is an advantage in modern society. These interactions leave Chris feeling increasingly uncomfortable, as the guests seem more interested in his race than in him as a person. At the party, Chris meets Jim Hudson, a blind art dealer who seems genuinely interested in Chris's photography. Unlike the other guests, Hudson appears normal and respectful, but his presence still feels slightly off. Hudson laments that he can no longer see Chris's work due to his blindness and wishes he could experience the world through Chris's eyes. During the party, Chris is startled to see another black man among the guests, who is dressed in old-fashioned clothing and behaves in an overly formal, almost robotic manner, similar to Georgina and Walter. Logan is married to a much older white woman, and his strange behavior further unsettles Chris. Feeling a need to connect with Logan, Chris tries to take a candid photo of him. However, when the flash goes off, Logan suddenly snaps out of his trance and violently grabs Chris, yelling, "Get out! Get out of here!" The outburst causes a scene, and the other guests rush to calm Logan down. Dean explains that Logan had a seizure, but Chris is deeply disturbed by the encounter. After the incident, Rose tries to comfort Chris, but he insists that something is wrong and they need to leave. Meanwhile, the guests participate in a silent auction where Dean holds up a picture of Chris, indicating that they are bidding on him. Jim Hudson wins the auction, signaling that he will be the one to take over Chris's body. Chris calls Rod, who has been growing increasingly worried about his friend. Rod warns Chris that something is seriously wrong and urges him to leave immediately. Chris agrees and decides to pack his things. While packing, Chris accidentally finds a hidden box in Rose's closet. Inside, he discovers a series of photographs of Rose with several different black men, including Andre and Walter, as well as Georgina. Despite Rose's earlier claims that Chris was her first black boyfriend, these photos reveal that she has had multiple black partners. Chris is horrified and realizes that Rose is not who she pretends to be. He tries to quietly escape, but when he confronts Rose, she drops her pretense of innocence. Chris is trapped, and when he attempts to fight back, Missy hypnotizes him again, sending him back into the sunken place. Chris wakes up in a dark, locked room in the Armitage basement, strapped to a chair. A mounted deer head stares down at him. In front of him is an old television, which begins to play a disturbing video. The video explains the Armitage's twisted process known as the coagula. The family, using Missy's hypnosis and Dean's surgical skills, has been transferring the consciousness of wealthy white people into the bodies of black individuals, whom they consider physically superior. The original consciousness of the black hosts is trapped in the sunken place, powerless to control their own bodies, while the white person's mind takes over. Chris realizes that Jim Hudson, the blind art dealer, plans to use Chris's body to regain his sight and continue his work as an artist. Chris is horrified as he watches the video, understanding the full extent of the Armitage family's evil scheme. He tries to find a way to escape, but he remains trapped in the chair, with the threat of losing his identity looming over him. Determined to survive, Chris notices that the chair he is strapped to is fraying. He manages to tear some of the stuffing from the chair and uses it to plug his ears, blocking out the sound of the teacup that Missy uses to hypnotize him. When Jeremy comes to take him to the operating room, Chris pretends to be hypnotized. As Jeremy begins to unstrap him, then Chris attacks him from behind. He attacks on his head, then he takes out the cotton from his ears and looks at the deer head. And he killed Dean, also using the deer's head, and stabbing Missy with a letter opener during a violent struggle. As he tries to escape, Jeremy, who is still alive, attacks Chris again, but Chris manages to overpower him, ultimately killing him. Chris takes one of the family's cars and drives away, but he accidentally hits Georgina, who is running towards him. Despite knowing that Georgina is part of the Armitage family's plot, Chris is reminded of his mother's death and feels compelled to help her. He puts her in the car, but she soon regains consciousness and attacks him, causing them to crash. Georgina dies in the crash, her consciousness briefly restored before she passes away. Stumbles out of the wrecked car. Rose, now fully revealed as a sadistic villain, emerges from the house with a rifle. She commands Walter, who is still under the Armitage family's control, to attack Chris. However, Chris uses his phone's camera flash to break Walter out of his trance. Walter briefly regains control of his body and, realizing the horrors that have been done to him, turns the rifle on Rose, shooting her before killing himself. Rose is wounded but still alive. As she lies on the ground, she tries to manipulate Chris one last time, pleading for help. However, Chris ignores her pleas and begins to strangle her. But he stops himself, realizing he doesn't want to become a killer like the Armitages. Just as Chris is contemplating what to do, a police car pulls up. The flashing lights and sirens suggest that Chris, a black man standing over a wounded white woman, is about to be arrested or shot. It turns out that the car belongs to Rod, who has been tracking Chris down after becoming suspicious of the Armitage family. Rod gets out of the car and helps Chris, leaving Rose to bleed out on the ground. The two friends drive away, with Rod assuring Chris that everything will be all right. As they drive away, Chris is in shock but relieved to have survived the ordeal. Rod jokes about how he knew something was wrong all along, and Chris silently reflects on the horrors he has just endured. The film ends with the two friends driving into the night, leaving the Armitage estate and its dark secrets behind. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more awesome content.